Thank you very much for joining, and thanks to our host from the European region of Tyrol for this very nice setting in Brussels, and also welcome to you out there online. Oops. Oh, how do I get back? Sorry. Okay, here we go. And so thank you for coming. I'm Mette Thurmansen, and I'm from University of Copenhagen, and have been the coordinator of EFFECT, which is about design and testing of agri-environmental schemes. And this is our end conference. So what I will do is just give some background for the project, and also try to set the scene to introduce the day, so that we start the more specific presentation on a common ground in terms of what we are doing. So the background for this project is that, as you'll all know out there, is that agri-environmental schemes have been the primary policy tool to achieve more sustainable practices in Europe for agriculture. However, there's little evidence of their success, and this led to a call that we applied for, and asked us to review the lessons learned across Europe about the use of agri-environmental schemes, and also try to design and test new and more innovative forms for agri-environmental schemes. So the traditional schemes are based on uniform payments, and they are in return for adoption of specific management interventions. So these traditional payment and adoption agreements, this is what we call contracts, and they are traditionally between a government agency and the individual farmer. And the farmers are then compensated in terms of their cost of adoption and also their income forgone. So they're not designed to really to give profits to the farms, but just to compensate them for their costs. So there are lots of challenges in designing more effective schemes, and I'll just introduce some of these challenges and the trade-offs that there are in design, and then we will dive into this more specifically as we go on in the day. So there are clear tensions between the income support functions of such schemes and their environmental performance. Also, agri-environmental schemes are voluntary schemes, so this means that participation of farmers is very essential. So they also have to be acceptable to farmers, but this also means that their environmental additionality have been challenged, because there's an incentive for farmers that are already complying with the scheme conditions to adopt. Another critical issue with these schemes is that the agricultural pollution that these schemes tend to try to mitigate are often characterized as non-point source pollution. So this means that it's difficult to really observe where the source of the emissions are coming from, and this means that this is a general challenge for regulation. Fourth challenge is that the agricultural landscapes that we're trying to improve are very heterogeneous, both in terms of their costs and their environmental pressures. So targeting is really quite essential in order to achieve both environmental and cost effectiveness. The fifth one is that our social norms and institutions are really asking and demanding that both voluntary and mandatory schemes are also seen to be fair. So having both heterogeneity and fairness can be a challenging to achieve both. And finally, what I will mention is the asymmetric information between farmers and the agency, which leads to both design and monitoring challenge. These are very brief challenges that I just ask you to bear in mind as we go along into individual presentations, where we'll dive into these in more depth. So I'll also introduce some key terminology that we will be using in the day, so that you have a chance if you're not familiar with this in the audience, just to ask or reflect over what this means. So both we talk about results versus practice-based payments. And results-based payments are contracts where the payment is fully or partly dependent on the outcome that the farmer is achieving. So this means the farmers are directly incentivized to deliver the outcomes because the more outcome they deliver, the more they will be paid. On the other hand, practice-based agri-environmental schemes are contracts where the payments are based on the management practice that the farmer undertake. So these practices, of course, have an expected effect on the desired outcome, but they are only rewarded for the practice that they're actually undertaking. We also distinguish between individual and collective schemes, where individual contracts are the traditional contracts, where they are between the individual farmer and the contracting agency, where collective contracts are contracts where the payments are designed to take into account that the behavior of a group of farmers, not just the individual farmer. So these contracts include a continuum of contracts that are both directly or indirectly seeking to encourage collaboration or coordination between farmers to achieve more sustainable outcomes. So these are sort of very basic definitions that we'll be using today. So who are involved in effect? These are an overview of the partners that have been contributing to the results. And the way we have been organized is this so working structure. So where you see on your left-hand side that we're trying to outline the basic elements that we need to look at in order to understand if you are in a given agri-environmental context, what are the motivating factors, the barriers, and the environmental outcome indicators to allow us to achieve more successful outcomes. So this is on your left-hand side. On your right-hand side, we have organized our cases, which have been also where we have had our interaction with other types of stakeholders than just academia. So in the middle, you see the logic of the research flow, that we've tried to review the lessons that are learned in the past. We've tried to analyze the existing contracts. We've then experimented with these contracts in order to achieve more innovation in these types of policy instruments. And of course, this is also with this in mind that we are here today. We try to see if we can get people out there to be interested in what we have to say. So our case studies have been organized across Europe, and all of them, as we'll go into them during the day, are organized as with an academic partner and what we call a practice partner that work together in the local setting to try to experiment with a specific agri-environmental contracts. And we'll hear more about this shortly. So what do we mean by testing contracts? We've sort of looked at it in a sort of policy cycle framework, where you have a environmental policy problem. You try to think of how you might address this, the policy options that you have. You choose a policy. There's also an implementation challenge. And once you've tried to implement it, you need to think about how successful you have been in your policy evaluation phase. And you might realize that you have not entirely reached the goal, and use the cycle start again. So what does it then mean for testing agri-environmental schemes? So this takes us to two different ways of doing it that we have used. So you can look at the existing schemes, and there we have looked at economic and environmental impact evaluation. We've also done interviews and surveys with stakeholders about their experience with existing schemes. We've done country case comparisons, and we've also done ecological surveys to look at their impacts. And on the new schemes, so when we try to formulate new ideas, but we have no evidence of how they perform on the ground, we are on the right-hand side of the diagram. There we've used environmental economic modeling, we've used surveys with farmers, we've used social experiments, cost-effectiveness analysis, and also tried out different ecological treatments. So this is what we mean by testing contracts, is that we either test new ones or test the performance of existing ones. So if you think about the program that we have here, so the logic is that first I'll give the floor over to Sven, who's going to dive into a bit more into how this conceptual framework of understanding whether agri-environmental schemes have impact. And then when we go into the more specific cases in more depth, the first session is about existing agri-environmental schemes, and that is essentially on the left-hand side in the policy evaluation. And then we go over to the new innovation, and this is where we do not have evidence from the existing, but trying to experiment ex ante with different forms of designs. And then in the end, we will have our sister projects are here to discuss with us and reflect on our approach and our results, and we'll end with some general discussion. So this is the plan for today, and I hope that this makes sense. And I will leave it now to Sven to make it make more sense. Thank you very much.
Good morning, my name is Sven Wunde. I'm from the European Forest Institute. And as Mette said, the idea is to give a little bit of a context about conceptual framework that we have been working with. And this is in particular the theory of change framework, which perhaps some of you will know from other areas of work as well, where you typically look at complex systems and you see how different types of treatments nurtured by certain inputs from outside stepwise are having producing some outputs, some outcomes, and some impacts. And here what we've been trying to do is to sort of lay open what we think are the assumption behind how agro-environmental schemes are supposed to work. We think that there needs to be some legal framework and some financial resources, etc. There's a number of information that is needed about the baseline assumptions, about the scenarios we could expect without such an intervention. Then you need to design the intervention, and agro-environmental schemes are part of the larger family of payments for environmental services, where you have a kind of a conditional design. You pay for a certain result, be it an outcome or an impact. And typically, you besides of the pure economic incentive element, you have other complementary tools like technical assistance, like maybe environmental education, etc. So then, in terms of the outputs, you would want to first have farmers participate at a significant scale in these treatments. you would want them to understand what they actually need to do in the contracts that are being designed. And you would want to see some change in attitudes. And then you can see the outcomes that's where kind of the rubber hits the road in terms of these interventions. Are they actually changing, farmers changing practices? Are they changing a certain land cover, or are they preserving land cover which they otherwise would not have done? So it's all evaluated in terms of vis-a-vis a certain baseline of no intervention. And of course, we would expect changes in income as well. It's not all about the environment, it's also about generating additional farmer incomes. And finally, at the impact level, that's where we would sort of measure the environmental services at stake. That can be in terms of improved watershed services or improved biodiversity in the area. And on the other side, again, that farmers actually are better off in terms of and feel themselves that they are better off compared to what would have happened without. And for each of these stages, we can at the bottom also identify certain preconditions and certain factors that will be act as leverage in terms of making each of these transitions effective. As Mette showed, these are our case studies in the 9 case studies across Europe. And as you can see, there's different focus in three areas: water quality, plant biodiversity, and bird biodiversity as key elements. And we can say there's some thematic focus also in each of these case studies that will vary a bit across the spectrum. And some of the things mentioned by Mette already are also here, like individual versus collective schemes, result versus action-based schemes, etc. So not all of these things have been dealt with in every case studies, but there's a critical mass. This is to show you there's a critical mass of comparison across cases and across thematic focus areas. So our task has then been to try to extract some of these lessons from the case studies and relate them to this conceptual framework concerning the theory of change. And I'm not going to go into detail with each of these, but you can see some of the same areas are outlined here. The same areas, for instance, bonuses can increase. I'm picking one of these. Bonuses can increase participation of reluctant farmers and reduce overall costs. And that one we could relate to the Dutch case and to the Danish case. So we'll be able to gather some feedback on our basic hypotheses from our cases, drawing on the different publications and deliverables that have been put forward in the project. So let me zoom in on a few of those. So one is about design and participation. We can see that flexible contracts are a good thing for farmers because they can achieve a good level of alignment with their own farming objectives. And participation will typically be higher if you offer a menu of options. Of course, a downside of that can be if that menu is very large, then you will also have more farmers that will choose options where they already are pre-compliant, so they don't have to change anything. So that's something to keep in mind. We can see that the farmers that have capital-intensive operations with high inputs per hectare, they typically tend to have higher opportunity costs, and everything else being equal, they will participate less in these schemes than the more extensive farmers. And we can see that there are certain add-on features in the design of the instruments that can matter. Of course, agri-environmental schemes, they are an incentive, they are a carrot, you can say. But maybe in some cases, if you can add a carrot element, for instance, in terms of bonus payments for collective participation, etc., that can be something that enhances participation. Sometimes if you can add also a stick, which could be a threat of being excluded if you don't collaborate, or that maybe if there could be a regulatory threat. So say if the carrot doesn't work, we're gonna put forward legal changes that will force you to comply. That is something that can help participation as well. And there can be sort of peer pressure factors in collective schemes that can also help make these changes in attitudes and in practices. Then in terms of practice or action-based schemes versus result-based contracts, we can see that farmers often, other things being equal, they will prefer a more secure payment for the action they are undertaking. We can also see in terms of measuring the monitoring and measuring the services provided, it can be difficult to do result-based schemes when watershed-related factors are the focus, because there is an uncertainty about the delivery of the environmental service over time, and it can be hard to attribute exactly to the action of the farmer, or it can be costly to do that. For the result-based payments, well, in some cases, the more extensive or the more environmentally inclined farmers are willing to accept those, assuming also part of the risk of delivery of the environmental service. So especially in biodiversity-related schemes, it can be a feasible thing. But we find maybe that combining action and result-based features in the same contract, a hybrid construction, can get you like the best of the two worlds. You can both give an extra incentive to the farmer, but also you're not expecting the farmer to take the full risk related to the service delivery. So some other features, things you can do, as Mette said, typically the typical baseline is to have flat payments, but differentiating these payments to give a higher incentives for those sites that are most important for the environmental service, or are most threatened or have the greatest leverage for achieving additionality. That can be a powerful factor in varying the payments. or of even spatially targeting the eligibility of farmers. You say, okay, we're going to offer this scheme, but not to everybody in the full landscape, but we're going to focus on those where we think it's going to make the greatest difference. So these are design options that are currently exploited in the schemes as we see them. And in some cases, combining multiple outcomes can also be an option, although it also adds a complexity to the schemes, and that can be challenging if you want to upscale it to higher levels. So it's typically something that is easier to do in smaller schemes. So we think a little bit about the setup for achieving environmental additionality, also from a conceptual point of view that has been put forward in the literature on payments for environmental services. You can see, you can ask two questions. Are these farmers already meeting the conditions for the environmental schemes? Are they pre-compliant? Even before any payments, and would they actually apply for payments? And that gives us like a small matrix of 4 different options, and we start in the north western corner. You can say some of them, they don't, they're not pre-compliant, but they're also not interested simply because their opportunity costs may be too high. So as this is a voluntary scheme, it's not worth their while to participate, right? And then moving clockwise, you can say some of them will be pre-compliant, and they will not apply for any payments because of they already have an intrinsic motivation to provide these services. So they are being good guys for free, right? And then you have the scenario where people would meet, they would be pre-compliant, but they would still apply for the payments. And there you have like a reward function. So you are rewarding the good guys, but you don't really have a change on the ground. And actually the only place where you would have an additionality is where there's previously is non-compliance, and through the an application for and the participation in these schemes, people are changing towards compliance with the contract conditions. So we can see sort of examples, and I've added below the reference to the case studies. We can see certainly examples of for instance, people that are not farmers are not interested in participating at all, but also in some that are achieving additionality, and how they many of them are distributed in several cells. So it's not an either or kind of thing. And then what we've been trying here to synthesize is to say, what are the typical contract features we've been looking at, like the results or action/practice-based, the individual and collective schemes, spatial targeting, and the differentiated payments. So each of these basic contract features, how do they typically correlate with certain objectives on behalf of the farmers, their uptake, and their welfare change, and for the environment, the environmental impact, and to a certain extent also at what costs is that environmental impact achieved. So the assumedly positive changes are marked in green, and the negative ones in red. And you can see, well, maybe there are a few examples that maybe, for instance, a collective scheme that it could both provide an additional benefit to farmers and to the environment, although at a certain cost. But for many of these different options, you can see that there is quite a division between the sort of the farmer objectives and the environmental objectives, in the sense that for instance, some of these more sophisticated environmental designs with spatial targeting or with differentiated payments, they are not so seen as so favorable by the farmers, because they will typically reduce their rents of provision of environmental services, but they may produce sort of environmental benefits. So this kind of underscores a bit what Mette was saying in the very beginning, that there are clearly some trade-offs to manage between the sort of farm support, farm income support functions and the environmental additionality functions of these schemes. Although it's not a type of trade-offs where you cannot find any measures that would try to balance those. And finally, what can we say, about the environmental effectiveness? How much bang for the buck, as they would say in the US, do you get from agro-environmental schemes? So I think if we look at the literature, and even if you look at the research done in this project, a lot of the empirical studies are looking at things in the middle part of the theory of change, typically, for instance, on how do you increase participation of farmers. But that is not always, that can be a really important thing, but it's not always that you increase the participation will not always in and of itself lead to a greater environmental impact, because it depends on other factors. So on the impact side, what we can see on the environmental impact side, we can see that there are very few sort of hard, meaning impact evaluations that are using rigorous techniques for evaluating exposed whether these interventions have had an impact on how large it is. And even on the socioeconomic side, that is somewhat reduced. Those that we have also here in this project they typically have a quite mixed record. But I think we need to think about how much do we as a society actually really want to know more about this question, because it's also a politically loaded question, of course, to lay open on the ground exactly what the impacts from these schemes on the environment and on the farming income side will be. So I leave this for further reflections and hopefully to be further enlightened through the case studies throughout the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. I'm wondering if there's any questions from the floor. Yeah, Nick.
Ben, thanks. So that slide you had where you had those two questions, like would we get the environmental outcome anyway? And if we would farmers join the net? Yeah. So if you have yes and yes, you say we have adverse selection bias. I'm just not sure that that's true for either of the case studies that we looked at, because in the biodiversity offset market, you only get awarded a credit if there's an increase in biodiversity over the baseline. So the environmental good goes up if there's a payment. And obviously in the payment for modeled results case study, if your payment is proportionate to what is predicted to be the increase in the environmental good, then I don't see how that's an adverse selection effect.
But are these increases measured on a individual farming baseline? So for each farm, you're going to have a baseline of what would have happened then?
Yeah.
Yeah. Then I would say then probably there should not be a UK letter in that particular cell. And I think many of these things can be discussed. But I think it is an issue. I think it's seldom that you have a very exact farm level baseline that you can refer to it.
Yeah. So I guess for us, it's an artifact, a result of how we do the modeling, because we predict, before and after for each farmer. So obviously you wouldn't do that in the real world.
Exactly. I was going to ask, is that something you can replicate in a real setting?
So I just want to make sure that there are not other burning questions. Yes, Frank? Oh, wait.
I have a comment. Maybe it's only a Danish viewpoint, but there is also a fear from farmers. If they get these red list spices on their land, then the value of the land can go down for them. So that is a fear that they have in Denmark. And then I think that a lot of schemes in EU have a dilemma, because it's quite hard to make nature with agriculture schemes. I think that is also a part of it. And I think it's quite an important part of it.
So I think that's true. That's not only farm income consequences, but also farm value, asset values. And it's about the permanence of some of these changes. And whether you could also think about it once they are installed, then maybe there's a regulatory threat of making them permanent afterwards. So I think those are additional fears that are legitimate.
Okay, thank you very much. In order to stay on time, I will go to the next point, and which means that I'll invite Julia to. I think you just have to unmute yourself, but I think.
Yes, can you hear me?
Because I don't know. Can I just ask? Do I have to then control the slides? Or can?
Oh, I can also share my screen if it's more convenient.
Yeah, but your slides are here. So if you just need, I can see you. So you just on the back screen. So you just give me a nod and I will click the thing.
Okay, so I will maybe do like this and sign you somehow, and you know that it's the next slide. Okay, thank you so much, Mette. Okay, so in the meantime, just to briefly introduce myself. So hi everyone, I'm Julia Bazzan, and I was a postdoctoral researcher for the EFFECT project for 3 years. First at Wageningen University and then at Copenhagen University. And now actually I became assistant professor at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, but it's a real pleasure for me to be here today and be able to present some of the findings of our work package. So I'm giving this presentation also on behalf of my colleagues, Jeroen Kandel from Wageningen University and Karsten Daugwirk from Copenhagen University. And what I will be briefly discuss with you is about some principles for designing effective ecosystem service delivery measures from the perspective of our work package, which was about institutions. And so we studied into our work package to what extent the institutional design of this kind of agro-environmental arrangements affected their implementation success in delivering agro-environmental services. And to do so, in our work package, we conducted a comparative analysis of 6 existing voluntary schemes across the EU that are some of the cases that were studied within the EFFECT project. And these schemes deliver different agriculture ecosystem services. So we particularly investigated a scheme enhancing nature conservation and water quality in the Netherlands. And I know there will be also a more specific presentation about it. Specifically in the region of Friesland, a scheme in Hungary, Spain, particularly Catalonia, Estonia, Germany, and Romania. And we mainly draw 3 key lessons that emerged from the research as being, oh no, sorry, I'm just, sorry, can you go back to, yes, sorry. And has been particularly relevant. So the first one is the scheme type, and it's been already introduced, this particular principle, but the idea that you can choose between individual or collective and having action-based or results-based. And from our investigation actually emerged that this is not the sole enabler of a successful implementation. And particularly, you can go to the next slide, thank you. Our findings actually portray a quite nuanced picture of the relationship between the scheme type and implementation success of this kind of schemes. So among the 6 voluntary schemes that we compared, there were both successful and unsuccessful cases of action-based and result-based scheme, as you can see from this table. And this actually suggested that scheme type is not the only factor that is influencing the implementation success, and that actually the institutional conditions have an important influence on implementation success. So this has been one of our kind of starting point, let's say, for our investigation. And yeah, you can move on. Thank you. Yes. So what we did, we of course first started from the big question, which is what actually then constitutes successful implementation of agro-environmental schemes. And in our research, we propose a conceptualization of implementation success along 2 dimensions. On the one hand, the extent to which farmers actually participate in a scheme and whether the uptake of this kind of schemes increased over time or decreased. And on the other hand, the capacity of farmers to actually meet the requirements of the schemes. And so also if they were able to actually overcome barriers and difficulties that they were encountering while implementing the scheme. And to grasp these 2 dimensions, we conducted several interviews, and I will now tell you a little bit more about our findings. So next slide, thank you. And so as I said, yeah, so here, yeah, I put here a little presentation just to give you an idea of how 2 examples from 2 of our cases. Here we have one example of successful individual results-based scheme. And that's one of our case studies, and that's a result-based grassland conservation scheme targeting plant species conservation. And that was initiated in the state of Bavaria in Germany. And this results-based scheme has been piloted during the program period 2015-2020. And another example of a successful individual results-based scheme was the pilot scheme running in Romania between 2015 and 2019. And that was led and implemented by a non-governmental organization. And in this latter scheme, 30 species have been selected and tested. And the individual farmers that were uptaking the scheme were paid by results of measured species diversity on their farms, and they had the freedom to choose actually the management practices according to the local conditions in their specific farm. Next slide, please. And yeah, and then we had an example of a successful collective action-based scheme, and that was that's the Dutch case, the scheme that I was telling you about that was run in the region of Friesland in the Netherlands. And I won't go too much into the details here because I know that there will be another presentation about this, but this is just to kind of show, precisely as I said, that there's some kind of a more nuanced picture here when we talk about successful schemes. It's not just about individual or collective and action-based or results-based, but we can have different combinations of these two elements. And next slide. And a key insight that emerged from the research is that the institutional conditions are actually making a difference for the extent to which the implementation succeeds. And in our research, we kind of intended institutions as the formal and the informal rules, the norms and the procedures that are shaping the actions and the interactions taking place into this kind of arrangements. And these rules are actually constraining the actions while are also facilitating other kind of practices. So our claim is that institutional design of these agro-environmental governance arrangements is an important condition, and this encourages the desired actions and interactions supporting the implementation of the schemes. And our findings are suggesting that there is actually an unutilized potential for designing more effective schemes by taking a broader governance approach. And what you can see here from this table, what we did was to precisely look into these kind of rules that were shaping these schemes. And we categorized our cases according to some of these institutional conditions, particularly the participation in the design. So whether there was some sort of participation of the different stakeholders involved in the scheme, in the design of the scheme itself. And there was quite some variety across our cases. So we had in some cases stakeholder consultation, in other cases we had limited involvement through maybe some working groups, and in other it was just very limited stakeholder involvement. The second dimension was role definition, so whether it was clearly defined, if there were overlapping roles among the stakeholders involved. And our findings suggest that actually in all our cases that we studied, there was a clearly defined roles and not much overlapping functions among the stakeholders. A third important element was flexibility, so whether implementation was rigid or if it was flexible. Another element was whether it was bottom-up or top-down kind of scheme, and we also have some variety. It continues in the next slide. And knowledge exchange, so whether information was provided somehow to the stakeholders involved, if there was collaboration and training provided to the farmers participating in the scheme. Next slide, please. And yeah, and this is just to show you also the other three cases. So you can see that there's some also some diversity in flexibility and bottom up versus top down kind of scheme. And yeah, so as I said, like in addition to the designing the specific measures of the scheme, what we suggest is that policy designers should also design the institutional setting in a way that can actually facilitate farmer participation and engagement. Next slide. So the comparative analysis that we conducted showed that implementation of these kind of schemes is successful when the institutional design simultaneously facilitates, on the one hand, knowledge exchange, flexibility in implementation, and inclusion in the design process that shape the governance arrangement. And this is the distribution of the 6 cases that we examined in the project. So you can see that we have the most successful cases that I already briefly introduced before, the Dutch case and the Romanian case, where we have a high level of knowledge exchange, flexible implementation, and an inclusive design process. While we have on the other side of the spectrum, low knowledge exchange, non-flexible implementation, and non-inclusive design process, the Hungarian and the Catalan case. And then we have also some intermediate cases. So actually, so we don't only have the 2 extremes, but also intermediate degrees of implementation success when only 1 or 2 of the institutional conditions are present. So while this finding may somehow appear also unsurprising for some of you, for us, what was particularly noteworthy is that this combination of institutional conditions only occurred in 2 of the 6 cases. So this suggests that there are still opportunities for more optimal institutional design of this kind of schemes. Next slide, please. Yeah, so so this was like the key lesson of our part of the research, and so our suggestion is really for the policy designers to work through the lenses of a broader governance perspective, and particularly from our work package, we can set out some contributions. First, an empirical contribution. So we examined a wide diversity in design and in implementation success. So we kind of covered a wide range of diversity on both sides. So what we wanted to explain, so the different degrees of implementation success and the institutional conditions that were actually kind of leading to these different degrees of implementation success. Theoretical contribution as well, so the implications in particular of intermediate conditions, that it's not all just black and white, but it's pretty more nuanced. But also a methodological contribution, and that's because we didn't look at just these kind of institutional conditions in isolation, so the effect of this on implementation success in isolation, but in combination, in conjunction. And so we use this configurational comparative approach that was in this typology that I showed in the previous slide, but also a practice contribution. And we produced a policy brief where we drew these lessons and we outlined some recommendations. And of course, there's also still potential for further research, even though the project is coming to close today, but still there's always room for more research and more learning to do. And particularly our suggestion is that would be interesting to examine also collective results-based measures and expanding the population of the cases, because we actually investigated through qualitative interviews these 6 cases in the EFFECT project, but the next step could be to actually expand the population and also investigating other conditions, because of course we underline the importance of taking this broader governance perspective and of these institutional elements, but there could be also other institutional elements that could be actually investigated. So that's it. So thank you for your attention, and happy to answer to any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you, Julia. You will, I hope you hold on there, and we'll go on to the next presentation, and we'll have questions in the end. So I'll now introduce Lisbeth, who's going to talk to us about the Dutch collective scheme.
Yeah, yes, it does. So, yeah, very happy to be here. I'm going to bring together a number of results from the EFFECT project from a number of studies that I did together with colleagues at Wageningen, Melody Splinter, who is here, also Insa Tierman, who is online, I suppose, and Brechtje Silvius, who is now working at the Dutch Environmental Agency, and of course also our practice partner, the Noordelijke Friese Walden, who is one of the collectives in the Netherlands. I'm going to talk about a collective scheme that was already very briefly introduced by the previous speaker. And, well, as Mette introduced at the start in her presentation, traditional agri-environmental schemes involve contracts between government agencies or the government and individual farmers often. These schemes are criticized often because, well, you're targeting individual farmers that can take actions on their farms, but what is missing there is, of course, the landscape level element. And for a lot of ecosystem services that can be provided, this landscape level is very important. We'll be talking about biodiversity and meadow birds, and for that ecosystem service, the landscape level is very relevant. So, how did the Netherlands address this issue with, say, the previous installation of the Common Agricultural Policy and therefore also rural development policies and agri-environmental schemes? So since 2016, the Netherlands has chosen not to organize these agri-environmental schemes at an individual level anymore, but in a collective way. And for that purpose, 40 collectives were organized. Some of them are bottom-up organizations, so there were already some agri or environmental collectives active in rural areas, and some of them were merged together to come up with these 40 remaining collectives. Others were organized because of the requirement for implementing this policy. So this is a map of the Netherlands and the 40 different collectives. So you see that the whole territory of the Netherlands is covered by the 40 collectives. Farmers do not have to be a member of the collectives, but if they want to apply for agri-environmental schemes, they do have to be a member. So it can be that farmers that are not interested in these schemes are not members of collectives, but they cannot apply for the schemes if they are not a member. This is a representation that is used often in the Netherlands for how the system works. So the collectives are the intermediaries in the system between government on the one hand, so they contract with the provincial government, a regional government, about their area or their management practices, management agreements. That's on the front door, and then at the back door they have individual contracts with their farmer members, the farmer members that are interested in implementing some of the measures of the agri-environmental schemes. The collectives do this contracting, but it's important to know also that they are effectively also, of course, the intermediaries in terms of distributing the budget. So they receive the whole budget for agri-environmental schemes that are implemented within their territory. They are also the ones that are penalized if there are some controls that find out that farmers are not doing what they are meant to do. So, and they then have to put in place the rules of how to distribute those penalties or how to deal with that. And so they are the intermediaries between the government and the individual farmers that are contracted. These collectives are put in place for this, among others, for this to address this criticism that there's not enough spatial coordination in the individual agri-environmental schemes. And so they are the spatial coordinators. They identify the areas where those bird scheme conservation practices have to be implemented. They also invite farmer members that are located in those areas. Only those farmers can participate in the agri-environmental schemes, and they then also make sure that a diversity of landscape elements or management practices are implemented at the fields of those farmers that are invited and that are participating in the a agri-environmental scheme. Different measures I presented this year in in an abstract way. To attract birds, and this becomes maybe a bit technical, but you need different kinds of measures to be taken. For instance, these concentric circles represent those different measures. So you need feeding areas, which can be provided by flooding fields, for example, because that's what is attracting insects, and birds can feed on those insects. Then around those feeding areas, you have resting areas where you can have herb-rich grasslands. And then other lighter measures are just agricultural fields, meadows, where nests are protected. So you have these different kind of measures, and it's important to have successful conservation, at least from ecological knowledge, that these mosaics, as they call it, are having these diversified management practices there. And that's exactly what those collectives are trying to establish, this diversity of different measures. And importantly also, of course, that these measures, it's not enough that one farmer does it on their fields, have all these different measures, but that these measures are distributed among fields over different neighboring farmers. And that's why you need that coordination. Now, that's the background of how the collective scheme works very quickly. What are some of the insights from the studies that we've done within the EFFECT project? And I'll look at 3 different things on the effectiveness of whether this spatial coordination actually is achieved. We try to go, or we have been thinking about how to look also at the bird numbers, and this are the results also there, but it's, well, the data were just not there to achieve this currently. I'll also say something about transaction costs of implementing this collective scheme, and at the end also look at let's say, some more innovative way, also looking at a results-based versus currently action-based scheme. All of this in the context of this collective approach. First, on the effectiveness, this is from a data set that Melody compiled. So what you see here is actually GIS data from the collective that we worked with. This is one of the 40 collectives in the north of Friesland, and it's only one part of their total territory. It's one of the mosaics, one of that diversified areas that they are targeting. On the left hand, and the different colors, and the areas with the different colors are contracted plots, contracted farmers' fields, and the colors represent the different measures. Remember, in the mosaics, you had these heavier measures of field flooding, which are the red areas, the wet areas. You have the resting areas, herb-rich fields, which are the white plots, and then the light measures, which are not so costly for farmers, are the blue areas. The left-hand side shows the situation at the start of the collective scheme, and then the right-hand side shows the situation 5 years into the collective scheme, so towards the end. You see this diversity in the different measures, the coordination of different types of measures that farmers can take. Red, blue, and white are represented. And then from before, or no, not before, but at the start of the scheme towards later on in the scheme, you also see an expansion. So more participation of farmers, also more, and the circles that I drew show a little bit that there's also more of those white areas, especially. More heavier measures, the herb-rich grasslands are targeted more. Now, what is also interesting to look at is, of course, how did it change from the individual approach from before 2016 to currently. This is another mosaic, so another part of the collective that we looked at. And a first thing that you notice, left-hand side, is before the collective approach was implemented. Right-hand side is towards the end of the collective approach. Well, not the end, but that contracting period. You see that the total area has shrunk compared to the individual approach. And this is a common observation in a lot of collectives. There are different ways to explain this. One is, of course, one has to do with the budgeting thing. The collectives can take up to 20% of the total budget for agri-environmental scheme payments for their own working, for their own administration. They obviously have cost of preparing all this and of organizing this. That means that there's less money left for the farmers, less money to implement the scheme or to pay farmers for implementing measures. The second thing, and that is interesting from the spatial coordination point of view, is that we see more red areas. More red areas, also more white areas. These are the heavier measures. That means that it's more costly for farmers to implement these, and therefore they also get higher payments. You get more higher payment contracts or more costly measures for the farmers. Therefore, also fewer farmers can be involved in the scheme. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's leading to less results or the results that you want to see. We can't show the birds numbers, but the whole idea of having this variety of measures, having the heavier measures where the feeding places for birds is intended to attract more birds. So spatial coordination is what we can see here. In that sense, we can see that there's a positive effect of this collective approach. Of course, for this case that we are representing here. Now, what about the costs of implementing this scheme and the transaction costs that the collectives have? One observation is obviously that the collectives have more costs in organizing this. There's a shift from costs for public actors, the government that used to contract with thousands of farmers, now only has to contract with 40 collectives. And on the public side, there's a decrease in transaction costs, but obviously the collectives themselves are taking a lot of those transaction costs. A second observation is that this collective scheme very much depends also on volunteers in the field. Volunteers that are motivating farmers, that are providing advice to farmers, that are going from field to field, that also have a role in monitoring for the collective. A lot of these efforts are not picked up in the transaction costs and the actual administration costs of the collective. So actually the costs of this approach are underestimated if you just look at the official numbers. And a third observation, and that's more a warning. So we could see some positive effects of this collective approach in the Netherlands, but it's very much a collective way of doing things. Is very much embedded in rural areas in the Netherlands. That doesn't mean that it's easy to replicate in other European or areas or elsewhere. And so that's just a warning. A last, or let's say a third study, looked at, again in the context of this collective approach, what if we were to move from an action-based to a result-based scheme? We did an experiment, a choice experiment based on that. I think the interesting point to point out here, and it goes back to one of the challenges also that was mentioned in the beginning, came up already in designing this hypothetical contract that we tried to test. There was a lot of resistance from farmers in the collective for a result-based scheme. Of course, it's more risky. You don't know what the effects of the weather or predators will be in terms of the results that you will get in bird numbers on your fields. But the element of fairness came up very much. If I put in effort and the birds go and nest in my neighbor's fields, that's not very fair. And my neighbor gets the payment. Another thing, so that fairness element, for that reason, we opted for a hybrid contract where we would have a collective bonus, which would be paid out to all the farmers that were contracted in the collective in case the collective was outperforming, let's say, the rest of the region, the rest of the province. And farmers would see that as much fairer, because then the efforts of their farmers in their collective would be rewarded. Okay? So that fairness point was elementary here. And also an individual bonus. we used in that experiment. So for farmers that were implementing those heavier measures, the more costly measures, they would get an additional bonus. And that was also because the farmers that we spoke to found that very fair. I mean, those that make the most effort should also get this on more than average reward for that. An actual reward, not just a compensation. And just, well, there were a lot of results from that experiment, but I'll just point out one that the collective bonus can actually increase the focus on these results. So it did show some positive effects on the likelihood to participate, but the bonus needs to be high enough. So low bonuses didn't have any effect. Right, well, that was in a nutshell, 3 different results from that research. And for those interested, we also have some papers coming out of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisbeth. So we'll also wait for this question for you until we have heard from Philip. And I can see that you are online, Philip. So I think you just need to unmute yourself. And as with Julia, you just nod or do something that gives me a signal, and I will control your life in the next 15 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Okay,
clearly.
Great. So good morning, everyone. Unfortunately, I did not make it to Brussels, so I have to give this presentation online, and you can already see what it will be about. It will be about result-based schemes in Bavaria, Germany. So in our work package, we specifically had a look at result-based schemes. So we were not the only ones who did this. There are a couple of effect partners who also, as you have just seen with Lisbeth, who had a look at result-based schemes, but we had a very specific one in Bavaria. And in this presentation, I will focus mainly on this one. Can we move to the next slide? The next slide, please. I can also continue talking meanwhile. So for a start, but Mette, are you there? Hello.
We can see your slide, but in the room, but maybe not online. So we're just
yes, sorry,
on the techniques at the moment.
Okay, I cannot see it here, but if you can see it, that's fine. So yes, for a start, I wanted to remind you of all the different contract solution or novel mechanisms that we had a look at in effect, or some of these, and I have actually stolen this slide from Uwe, so you might see it later on also again. So out of all of these different approaches that we have, collective ones, auction, spatial coordination, or more novel ones like the ones where you have a look at social capital, we had a look at result-based schemes. And result-based schemes are schemes, and you have heard this before, that pay farmers for actually providing a result. So this is the big difference compared to action-based schemes. While with action-based schemes, you follow specific management requirements, and then you get the payment. And with result-based schemes, the difference is that you only receive the payment if you can really prove that due to your management, you have made this result possible, this environmental outcome. And typically what we see with result-based schemes is that they mainly focus on species, so certain grassland species or birds or whatever, because this is relatively easy to implement and also to control for authorities. So these contracts, and then I would move to the next slide, and I can still not see the actual slide, but I will talk about slide 3 now, about potential advantages of these schemes. And compared to action-based approaches, they have gained popularity in recent years, especially due to these advantages. And these advantages are listed here. So the main ones are that first, they encourage farmers to really actively think about environmental protection and to kind of innovate to produce an environmental outcome on environmental good. So they do promote the development of new skills and new knowledge, theoretically. They also ensure that farmers are paid for the actual provision of an environmental outcome, and not only for a service that they for a management practice that they perform. So this is kind of in line with the Quay's theorem, and this is why also it is better to justify these kind of schemes or payments because it's public money in the end, right? So if you pay for an outcome and not only for a management practice where you are not sure whether the outcome is really achieved, then this is better to kind of justify. Also, these schemes, they raise the intrinsic interest of farmers in achieving environmental objectives. So you kind of raise the social capital, you raise awareness with the farmers. So they try to really integrate these ecosystem service provision into their farming practices, into their management system, and into how they do business. So in the long run, you can think of them being or providing environmental or ecosystem services as one part of their farm businesses. Also, a main advantage of these schemes is that they provide opportunities for individual and flexible site conditions. So the farmer knows a lot more than we do about the way he's doing his farming, about his land. And so he might be the one who knows best where to actually achieve the results, the environmental outcomes that are part of the scheme. Of course, they are fully flexible. This is also a big advantage for the farmer. So no management prescriptions from the authorities. It's up to him on how to achieve the goals. And this is theoretically the main advantage compared to action-based approaches. Also, it has been shown in some literature that potentially these schemes achieve environmental improvements at lower public and also private costs than the action-based schemes. Then I would move to the next slide. So this would be slide 4.
Case study now, Philip?
Exactly the case. Thank you. So these advantages, the potential advantages, have been recognized by the federal state of Bavaria in 2015. So they decided to integrate a result-based measure aiming at maintaining species-rich grassland as part of their rural development program. And they focused on species-rich grassland because these kind of grasslands are really biodiversity hotspots in Europe. And if they are extensively managed, you really do find a lot of not only grassland species, but also animal species on these kind of fields. But we, especially in Bavaria, have seen that these kind of grasslands are threatened. So they are threatened both by intensification, but also by abandonment. And in Bavaria, we do find these grasslands typically in the Alpine region, but also in the lower mountain ranges. And so the federal state of Bavaria introduced this result-based measure in 2015, and it's part of a bigger program. It's called the Bavarian Cultural Landscape Program, the Kulturlandschaftsprogramm. And from 2014 to 2022, that's the last programming period, this program had a budget of more than 1 billion euros. So it's a really big program, and it has 33 different measures. And out of these measures, the result-based measure is one. It's very popular, this whole program in Bavaria. We had around 50,000 participating farmers out of, well, around 100,000 farmers that we still have in Bavaria. So this is half of the whole farming population, quite a big number. And it has 4 priorities: biodiversity, and this is where the result-based grassland measure is part of, soil and water protection, climate protection, and cultural landscape. I would then move to the next slide, and here you can just see on some pictures different kind of schemes that are part of this Bavarian Cultural Landscape Program. It really has a broad variety of options, or also a broad variety of farmers that we have in Bavaria. So there are schemes for animal welfare, but there are also schemes for landscape diversity measures. So flower strip schemes, cattle grazing schemes, low emission manure application, and so forth. I move again to the next slide, and this would be slide 6, where we have a look at how this new result-based conservation measure was actually taken up by farmers in Bavaria. So first, about the scheme itself, it has a payment rate of 250 euros per hectare, and you get this payment if you can prove that at least 4 out of a predefined number of species, of grassland species, can be found on your fields. And you have to prove this, that by taking a diagonal line through your field, and along this line you should be able to recognize 4 of these species, of these grassland species, and not only like at a certain point of the field, but overall over the whole field. So this is how it works. You as the farmer are also responsible for doing the monitoring. So how was it taken up? That was the question. We can see here for the 4 first years, this is the most recent data we have, that, well, roughly 800 to 900 farmers were participating in the scheme. What we can also see that the spending was around, well, 1.2, 1.3 million euros per year, and we have roughly 5 to 5,500 hectares that are under contract with this scheme. What we can see is that the uptake rates are rather low if we compare them to an action-based measure, that is an action-based grassland conservation scheme that exists alongside with this new scheme. So in this action-based scheme, we have 8,000 participating farmers. So this is a lot more. And we have these farmers despite the payment actually being lower for this scheme than for the result-based one. On the map on the right-hand side, you can see a little bit where most of the farmers participate. So this is what I've mentioned before. In the Alpine region, we see a lot of spending, and we see also in northern and eastern Bavaria, where we have more lower mountain ranges. We can see also that the uptake rates there are higher than in other parts of Bavaria. But now let's move on to what we actually did in terms of analysis concerning this scheme. So I move to slide 7 now. And on slide 7, you can see
we are on emerging questions.
Exactly, that's the slide. Thank you. So we kind of split our analysis in 2 ways. So first, we had a look at effectiveness of the schemes, but also at the adoption of schemes. And if I say schemes, I mean we had a look at action-based schemes and also result-based schemes. We did this because we wanted to learn from what was actually going on with the action-based schemes, whether these disadvantages actually hold, and whether the new scheme really performs better as we have theoretically seen. So we did effectiveness studies first on existing schemes, then adoption studies on existing schemes like action-based schemes, and the same with result-based schemes. And in the following slides, I want to give you some insights from these studies. So I move on to slide 8, the effectiveness of existing schemes. So here and on the following slides, I just put some information about the methods we used, about the empirical case or the cases, and about the main results. And below you can always see where this was published or is about to be published. So whoever is interested can read more there. First, about the effectiveness of the schemes. Well, which methodological approach did we choose? We chose data envelopment analysis and combined this with classical impact evaluation tools, especially matching techniques and difference in difference. Also, we did some spatial econometrics. The question is, why did we use data envelopment analysis with a desirable technology and undesirable bioproduction technology? We did this in order to be able to measure on the farm level both environmental or ecological and economic effects, because typically what we can see in impact evaluation studies is that there is a focus either on the economic side or on the ecological side. So with data envelopment analysis, if we have different outputs and one output is a marketable output and the other one a non-marketable ones, we are able to see trade-offs, but we're especially able to see how the scheme affects both of these important categories. So the empirical cases we had a look at were first the Bavarian one. We had a look at Bavarian dairy farms surveyed between 2013 and 18. And then we had dairy and crop farms from Germany, Italy, France, and the Netherlands. So these were, this was done with FADN data. And we had a last study that had a look at groundwater quality again in Bavaria. The main results that we could see were that agri-environment schemes, they did not change the farm's economic and environmental efficiency. So we had a look at environmental efficiency, but also at green productivity. Environmental efficiency, that's or eco-efficiency, as you might also call it, I can describe this as the efficiency of providing a good output with respect to an environmental output. So that is, if you are more environmentally efficient, you would be able to produce more of your farming output by keeping your environmental pressure constant, or you would reduce your environmental pressure and keeping your marketable output constant or higher even. So this is eco-efficiency or environmental efficiency. Of course, you can question whether a scheme should really have an effect on eco-efficiency, or whether you would only want an effect on the actual environmental outcome, and you would have the payment as offsetting your economic losses. In any case, we found what has also been found in previous studies. So there was actually no real effect of the schemes on environmental efficiency nor on green productivity, and also not on the classical environmental categories that we would have, like spending on fertilizers or pesticides per hectare and so on. So this is concerning the existing schemes, the action-based schemes in Bavaria, but also in Europe. So we could kind of confirm what was also shown in previous studies. There's limited effects of these schemes. Then I would move on to the next slide. That would be slide 9, adoption of existing schemes. So now we are in the adoption part. And also there, first we had a look at action-based schemes. What can we learn from the adoption of action-based schemes? And there we, or like it was Caroline who did this study, did a systematic review of 20 years of ex-post empirical studies on agri-environment scheme adoption in Europe. And we had different constructs that were created, grouped into alignment, opportunity, engagement, and contracting. And they were considered to investigate how these constructs influence farmer decisions. Case here was Europe, like we had agri-environment schemes in Europe that we were focusing on. And the main results were that first, there is large contextual diversity in farmer decisions to participate, but we could kind of also again confirm what has been found previously in the literature, that it is important for a farmer to participate if he knows a lot about the scheme, if he has some detailed knowledge, if the contract design fits kind of to his management, that this is always key in these schemes. If a farmer is able to easily integrate the management prescriptions, or in the case of a result-based scheme, what needs to be done to achieve the outcome, then he is rather willing to participate in a scheme. So these were some critical factors that we identified, and we will hear from Caroline, I think later on, more about adoption, but this will be about result-based schemes. If I move on to the next slide, now we move on to the analysis we did concerning the Bavarian case study, effectiveness of result-based schemes. So I said before that theoretically, these schemes can be more effective in terms of producing an environmental outcome than action-based schemes. So we did one study that was kind of similar to the approach before. So again, we used data envelopment analysis to do economic ecological modeling, evaluating how efficient farms are participating in action and result-based schemes. again, we had marketable goods and non-marketable outputs. The non-marketable outputs was, in our case, biodiversity. So the data we used was, again, farm level data, but it was gathered through a survey in Bavaria in 2022. It was mainly Bavarian dairy farms that we surveyed. And the sample in the end was representative for Bavaria and included, and this is a big novelty of this study, it included farms participating in the result-based scheme, but also farms participating in the action-based scheme that still exists, and we had farms that did not participate in any scheme. And for all of these farms, we had some economic information that we gathered, but especially we had a biodiversity indicator based on grassland species found on the fields of the farm. So we really went out to the fields and counted grassland species and created out of this a biodiversity index or indicator. And this was then our biodiversity output for the model. And indeed, we found that result-based schemes do perform better than action-based schemes when it comes to the joint production of, in our case, milk and biodiversity. So we did find that these schemes are indeed preferable in terms of costs and the actual outcome that you can achieve. Of course, we did not include transaction costs in these studies, so this would be something to consider in the future, in future work. Then I move on to the last study we did. So this would be slide 11, adoption of result-based schemes. And about this study, we will hear something more from Caroline later on. Again, what did we do? What were we interested in? Well, we did a discrete choice experiment to investigate farmers' preferences for alternative grassland biodiversity payments. So we constructed some hypothetical and really existing schemes, and out of these schemes there was a result-based scheme, there was an action-based scheme, then kind of a hybrid scheme, and we were interested in which scheme a farmer would actually choose. Also, we had an ecological performance measure with the biodiversity index that we had built. So this study was done with the same data as the previous one, the Bavarian survey we did. And again, the sample included participating farms in the result-based one, in the action-based one, and non-participating farms. The results are quite interesting. So first, we could find that it's not the case that farmers would always prefer the result-based option because it's more flexible. So there were farmers who did prefer these result-based schemes, but these were typically more extensively operating farms. So one can speculate that these were the farms that already knew that they, due to their management, were able to really provide these 4 species that were needed. But more intensively working farms were not really willing to participate because they just didn't see this scheme working in their farm management. So they are working quite intensively, so they need the high yield from the grassland in order to get also the milk yields they need. And then they said if they would just manage extensively, this was not possible. So for them, that was not an option. But what was an option was a hybrid solution. So Lisbeth already talked about this before, and we also identified some farmers that would say, yeah, we could combine elements of result-based and action-based schemes in order to get more farms participating in these schemes. So what can we conclude from all of that? I tried to put this in one slide. That would be the last slide, slide 12. So first, traditional or action-based schemes, they seem to perform rather poorly concerning first environmental benefits, but also concerning joint economic ecological results. They do not seem to encourage farmers to improve their environmental efficiency, nor do they improve green productivity. And this would, of course, be important considering that we need to produce more with less environmental pressure in the future. But what I have to say concerning all of these studies we did in terms of effectiveness, it was also difficult to really measure this additionality of schemes, to measure whether there are actual benefits. And there are two main reasons for that. First, many farms that we have in our sample have been participating for many years in the schemes already. So it's kind of impossible to identify really like new participating farms. And if you have a farm that participates in such a scheme for many years already, there might have been an effect that was observed in the past, but not observed by us. But the scheme effect might then just be that you keep the farm, you keep the effect that you have obtained in the past, but that we don't know. Second, it's still difficult to obtain farm level environmental information. So what we did, as I said, we gathered this biodiversity information on our own, but this was really costly in the end. It's not easy to do. Also, we're not specialists in this field. So if you use official data like FADN data, you still lack all of this information, but this would be crucial information to really do proper environmental effect studies. What we saw from our adoption studies, first, well, action-based schemes, they kind of remain popular, maybe more popular than result-based one. And the main criteria for farmers to participate are still the possibility to easily integrate the scheme into the farm management and also some detailed knowledge about the scheme. What we saw concerning the result-based schemes, well, these theoretical advantages of the schemes, they are known by the farmers, but still they are not the only drivers behind joining or not. We still have to consider that there's this risk that the farmer takes when joining, whether he really achieves the environmental goal. And so this is why hybrid schemes might be a better solution. And last but not least, we found some evidence that the result-based schemes do perform better than action-based schemes when it comes to the joint production of a marketed and a non-marketed good. So that was it from my side. Thank you very much. And I think there's some room for questions now.
Thank you very much. We are encroaching on our coffee, which is not a bad idea, not a good idea. But I just want to, if there's questions from the online audience that you want to raise, maybe one or before we can maybe discuss here over coffee. But I don't know whether there's any. I couldn't see whether there's any. There's one? No? So Sven, you have a comment?
No, it's just a short question because you're saying that it's hard to get by the environmental data needed to assess additionality at farm level. But then when you're doing these assessments of the result-based schemes and their impact on biodiversity and market goods together, doesn't that require actually some sort of biodiversity measures to be in place? So it would seem to be more, you would actually need to have more information to look at that.
Philip, do you want to, did you hear the question? Philip has gone. But I think it's I will just answer. I think it's a valid point that there's the huge limitations in actually the data available to measure some of these environmental outcomes from our schemes, and I think it's important that this is picked up so that the basis for evaluation successfulness can be improved in future. But with that, we will go and have coffee, but we will be back at 11. So hope this that the online community can also get back to us at 11. But I'll close here for now. Thank you very much.
Now, I think so. Do you hear me? Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Should we ask if they can see the presentation?
Is everything okay? Online? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Should I start? Or
Yes.
should we wait?
Once you start, they can't resist coming back
Yes.
in. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So good morning, everyone. So I'm Caroline Canessa from the Technical University of Munich. And actually, yes, my presentation is just a follow-up of the previous last presentation, and also it links to what has been presented by Lisbeth before. I'm presenting here the results of our case study, where we looked at farmers' preferences for practice or result-based schemes, so action or result-based schemes, and also at preferences for hybrid-based schemes. And this is a joint work with also my other colleagues at the chair, like Philip Manning and Professor Johannes Sauer. So just a bit of background, we have heard this, but so in this case, we are looking mainly at whether it's better to pay farmers for action or for results. So whether it's better to pay farmers for implementing specific management practices or for achieving predefined environmental outcomes. This is an ongoing discussion, and our study tries to provide some insights in how to try to address this question. And in terms of conceptual framework or what drove our research, this has been covered quite in details also before, but we can say there are some advantages and some disadvantages from result-based schemes, and the advantages, as already mentioned, are the increased management flexibility for the farmers, the fact that potentially by producing results, the farms are more induced to enroll land that it's additional, so provides additional results. Result-based schemes might also make production of environmental services more an integral part of the farming activities, and for the regulator, so from the regulator's perspective, it also creates this link between the payment and the result. But then there are some disadvantages which are mainly linked to participation that deter farmers to participate in this type of schemes. And the main one is the fact that the result-based schemes put all the risk of non-achievement on the farmers. So this is the risk is shifted from the regulator to the farmer. And also, if we look at how result-based schemes are designed so far, most of the result-based schemes foresee that monitoring is conducted now by the farmers who transmit the information to the regulator. And that involves additional transaction cost for the farmers. So these two disadvantages are seen as drawbacks that are affecting the adoption of these result-based schemes. As we saw before in the case of Bavaria, there has been a low uptake of this scheme. So this might be some of the reasons. And in order to address some of these disadvantages, hybrid approach are seen as a potential solution. So in this context, the idea of our research was to try to see whether actually from the farmer's perspective, they would prefer to be paid for action compared to for results or for a hybrid. So we conducted a discrete choice experiment in Bavaria, and we investigated the farmers' preferences for these 3 alternative contract designs, so results, action, and a hybrid. And we tried also to see if the preferences are linked to some type of characteristic of the farm, of the farmers. So we linked the preferences to the farm structural characteristics, but also to the ecological characteristic of the farms. And this second point, it's because of this additionality issue that we have been discussing also before, that in the specific case, we hypothesized that if mainly farms who have high ecological conditions or better ecological conditions choose to participate in result-based schemes, this might be an indicator of low additionality. In terms of case studies, so as presented before, Bavaria offered the perfect context to conduct such an experiment, because action-based measures for grassland biodiversity already exist. For example, late mowing, a ban of mowing before the 1st of July, or limited grazing, so limited livestock density. And also a result-based scheme also already exists. It has been introduced in the last funding period, and the farmers under these schemes are paid if 4 flowering species out of a list of 34 indicator species are present on their fields. And in the specific pilot schemes, the farmers have to conduct their own monitoring. So they do the monitoring of the enrolled plot, of the presence of the species, and then transmit the information to the ministry. So we use this setting and this information, so the existing CULAP offer, to create an experiment and to create a hypothetical offer for the farmers, where we offer them 3 types of alternative scheme: a hybrid scheme, an action-based scheme, and a result-based scheme. And we checked, so we tried to see which one they preferred. In terms of practices, you can see we included the current practices, and then in terms of ecological results, we referred to the indicator species that are already defined by the ministry in the result-based scheme. So this is how the choice card looked like. So you can see each measure represent actually one type of approach. So in the first case, measure 1, it's a hybrid where the farmer is paid for a specific action and gets a basic payment for that, and then he can get a kind of top-up payment for the ecological results that are achieved. And then in this specific case, the monitoring is done by the farmer. And in the second case, in the second measure, we have a pure result-based scheme. For the data collection, so we collected the data in person in different ecological regions of Bavaria in order to have a quite a good representation of the farmers, and we collected both structural data and also the ecological data that Philip was mentioning before. So we record the species richness, considering the indicator species from the list at the plot level, and aggregated this information at the farm level using a biodiversity index. And this biodiversity index is a simple way to average the number of species per hectare. This information allows us to approximate the ecological situation. Our different measures. In the first one, we try to estimate the probability of the farmers adopting specific scheme based on the control attributes, but also the scheme approach and the vertical status. And then we tried also to see where different groups of farmers that can different approaches based on the learners. And then we tried also to see if any of the contract features are also influencing the land allocation decision, so how many hectares the farmer is willing to enroll. So In terms of, so as regards the first question, so the contract attributes, as expected, the payment increases the probability of adopting, while the management practices, so the late mowing and the maximum livestock unit reduce the probability of adoption. There is a high reluctance toward late mowing, and this is because it's slowly compatible with profitable dairy farming. Then, I didn't indicate the indicator species, but each additional indicator species also reduces probability of adoption. In terms of monitoring, it's quite interesting. The Bavarian farmers would prefer to do their own monitoring compared to having an authority doing a yearly inspection of the farms. And then maybe the most interesting part, it's related to the approach. So we see that there is a tendency to prefer result-based approaches or hybrid-based approaches compared to action-based. And we tried to, we interacted this parameter with the biodiversity index to see if the biodiversity index can explain partially this preference. And we see that farmers with higher biodiversity might tend to choose result-based schemes. And this confirms our hypothesis of this potential lack of additionality. And then in terms of classes, we also identified two groups of farmers based on their preferences. We clustered or divided them in two groups, the intensive and extensive type of farms, based on the different variables. So in the intensive type of farms are mainly dairy farmers, active dairy farmers who are full-time doing full-time farming. And we see that the intensive farmers, they are not so driven by the payment as the extensive one. So their choice might more be driven by the specific management practice that it's required. So whether this management fits to their context or their farming style. And then they prefer to do the monitoring by themselves. And they tend to prefer a hybrid-based approach, while the extensive type of farmer, it's more driven by the payment and tend to prefer a result-based approach. As an additional result for the land allocation decision, so the payment also influences how many hectares the farmer wants to enroll. So the higher the payment, the more the hectares. Interesting, it's the monitoring parameter. So if the farmers have to do the monitoring by their own, then they would enroll less areas of their farm. The same for the result-based approach. And instead, the biodiversity index, so the better the ecological conditions are, and the more is the land that the farmer is willing to enroll. So just to bring together all these results and conclude, we could say that there is no clear preference for any of the approaches. So there is no clear preference for one or the other, but there is an overall rejection of action-based schemes, and that can be linked also, can be due to the specific type of measures we also included in the scheme, in the design. They were quite strict. So that's why there might be a high rejection. But we can see that the payment mechanism, it's not the main driver of the farmer choice. And then it's a combination of the applicability of the practices, if they feel that these practices fit their farming context, and especially if the outcomes can be easily achieved. And also we saw that the farm structure can explain better the preferences. So as in terms of implications, this supports the idea that there is a need of targeting the farmers and tailor the payment based on these on the farm characteristic, but also based on the primary objectives of the scheme. So in the specific case, we can see that if the idea is to maintain extensive farms, so hybrid-based schemes might be a more appropriate approach. If the objective of the scheme is to induce farmers to partially start to extensificate some parts of their land, maybe then hybrid-based approaches might be more indicated. And in terms of additionality, so this our results that are showing that higher biodiversity, like farmers with higher biodiversity tend to accept results-based schemes more frequently, show that there is a potential lack of additionality, and that again supports the idea that the scheme design should take into consideration the final objective. So for example, if the objective is to modify the practice, then maybe baseline measures are needed. But if the objective is to maintaining specific practices, then result-based schemes without baseline measures can be sufficient. And during the data collection process, we saw that many farmers had problems in really familiarizing with the species and assessing whether their plots could really provide the required results. So this brings us to consider that on-site technical advice is needed. And in terms of validity of the results, we think that the specific case studies provide its quite robust results for the specific case study, but we would need to extend or replicate such a study also in other contexts for other type of environmental services to really see whether this applies to other regions or other farm structures. And I'm open for questions. Thank you very much.
Great. So we will move on to Nick and return to people and think about what they want to ask you.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. So yes, I'm going to talk about one of the case studies that we did at Glasgow as part of EFFECT. So this is looking at comparing payment for actions with payment for outcomes, but the difference in what we've been doing is thinking about paying for modeled outcomes rather than actual outcomes. So this is joint work with Catherine, who's here, and a group at Glasgow, Aberdeen, Tennessee, and Leeds. So as has already been stated by previous speakers, most current agri-environment schemes focus on payment for actions, but there's a big interest in paying for results, both within Europe and in the UK. As people have already suggested, Carolyn just stressed this existing body of work, which is to do with, well, in principle, why is paying for results a possibly good idea? And I guess the two main ideas are allowing farmers to make use of private information on how best to produce the outcomes that society wants, and reducing adverse selection, but also rewarding inventiveness in the production of the environmental goods that we're after. So if this is such a great idea, why don't we see more of these schemes in practice? So Carolyn's talked about one scheme in Bavaria, but there aren't so many schemes around the world. And as she mentioned, the big problem for the farmer is that enrolling in a payment for results, payment for outcomes scheme is much riskier, because I can undertake actions that should generate the environmental outcome that you're going to pay me for, but depending on the actions of my neighbors, or depending on the weather, or depending on what happens, for example, in a bird's overwintering location, I may not get the result that I hope for, and so I won't get the payment. And so therefore, we can expect lower participation in a payment for results scheme. And also, as people have pointed out, there are implications for monitoring costs for switching to payment for results. So this very interesting paper came out halfway through the EFECT project by Bartowski and colleagues, who said, hey, maybe there is an intermediate option here. And it's not the intermediate option that some people have already discussed this morning, which is a hybrid policy where you pay for a mixture of actions and actual results. It's a hybrid option where you actually pay for modeled results. And so the idea is that farmers would enter into a contract where their payment depends on the predicted results of their actions on some indicator. And that indicator could be the kind of plant species abundance that Carolyn was just talking about, or it could be a water quality change, for example. And where do those predictions come from? They come from a statistical or a process-based model that some experts have derived, which relate the actions that farmers take or the changes in those actions to this environmental outcome. And why is that an interesting idea for the farmer? Well, it's an interesting idea because it takes away all the uncertainty, all the risk from their action. Because all I have to do is undertake the actions, and what I get paid for is the predicted outcome, whatever the actual outcome is. So we might predict that more farmers would participate in a payment for modeled results option than in a payment for actual results. And it also has some advantages from the government's point of view, because firstly, compared to a simple payment for action policy, it allows us to take advantage of the heterogeneity which Mette referred to in ecological potential across space, and also the heterogeneity in opportunity costs across space, and also opens up lower monitoring costs than a pure payment for results. So the Bartkowski et al. Paper is like a conceptual, is this a good idea kind of paper? And so I think we were the first people who actually tried to simulate what would happen if you did this. And we did it in the context of an ecological economic model that we'd already set up to look at our biodiversity offset markets. And this particular set of results comes from our English case study area, which is in Tees Valley and Pennine Uplands. And it's focused on a particular outcome. And the outcome that the policy designer is trying to achieve is to increase the population of this specific bird. So this is the lapwing. It's a wader, and it's declining. It's red listed actually in the UK due to a decline in, well, one of the main reasons, decline in habitat. So our model, just very, very briefly, it's a principal agent model. Sorry, principal agent. It's an agent-based model linked up to an ecological model of which joins outcomes to actions. And essentially, in this model, we make a couple of assumptions. We assume that for the farmer to switch from what they do right now to a more conservation-friendly alternative, they must be offered a subsidy which is at least as great as the opportunity cost to them from changing their actions. And we compute those opportunity costs based on the actual distribution across space of farming profits. So as you can see on this graphic, there's a big heterogeneity in farming profits per hectare across our land area. So each grid square on this picture is one farmer. And we say, okay, we can simulate what will happen if we offer a particular payment for action or modeled results, if we can, for each grid square, compare how much money could you get if you switch land use with how much money do you currently make. And that's how we're going to proceed. And then we're going to match up the ecological consequences of that to the change in actions by using this ecological model. So we're going to compare, in the paper, we compare three policies. I'm just going to talk about two today. So the first is a simple payment for action. And the action here is to create low intensity grassland, because that's the habitat that this bird needs in order to survive. And so if you're currently growing wheat, let's say, I'm going to offer you a payment to switch that to low intensity grassland because I predict that that's going to increase the population and distribution of this bird. And we calculate that uniform payment on the average opportunity cost across the landscape. And then we compute what will be the total public sector cost of that policy. And to achieve a particular outcome, it's around about 1.6 million per year. And then we say, okay, let's take that same budget, 1.6 million pounds per year in that case study area, and let's now use that budget to pay for a modelled results policy. And so now each farmer is going to be offered a contract where their payment depends on how many extra lapwing birds do we think we will get if you switch your land use. And because there's a big variation across space in farmers' opportunity costs, and because there's a big variation across space in the ecological potential of land to deliver more lapwings, we get a big variation in what you could think of as the supply price, the cost per extra lapwing generated by farmers changing land use. And this upward sloping supply curve kind of captures some of that detail. So some farmers can deliver these birds very, very cheaply. For some other farmers, it's really, really expensive. And now we can look at some results. So if we look at participation, what's interesting is a payment for actions policy actually delivers a higher quantity of low intensity grassland creation than the payment for modelled results. You think, well, that maybe doesn't sound so good. And actually more farmers participate in this payment for actions compared to payment for modelled results. But the surplus to farmers is actually greatest in the payment for modelled results. But when we look at, and the budget is roughly the same across all three options, but when we look at, first of all, across space, who participates, and then we look at the predicted ecological consequences of these alternative policies, we see that actually the payment for modelled results delivers a much bigger increase in our target biodiversity outcome, which is the abundance of lapwings, than the payment for actions. So given that they have, for all practical purposes, the same budget, that means the cost effectiveness in terms of the target environmental outcome is much higher in the payment for model results case than in the payment for actions case. But what's also interesting is two birds that we don't target also benefit to a greater extent under the payment for modelled results than under the payment for actions. So these are predictions for the populations of two other wading birds found on low intensity grassland in our landscape, so curlews and oyster catchers, and they also benefit to a greater degree under payment for modelled results than under payment for actions. So that's kind of interesting. And so the take-home message from this paper is payment for modelled results in this specific example appears to be more cost-effective than payment for actions. And secondly, that we get these off-target environmental gains for these two species that also benefit from our action, restoring low-intensity grassland. So that's interesting. What are the limitations here of this approach? Well, firstly, this payment for model results approach does not actually encourage farmers to use their own private information on how best to generate the desired environmental outcome. Because essentially what we're doing is saying our model is going to tell us how an action translates into an environmental outcome. And if you undertake these actions, then these are the modeled results that we're going to pay you for. So what that doesn't do is protect one of the main advantages of a pure payment for results, which is making the most of farmers' private information. And secondly, there are some limitations of our ecological model. For example, we essentially assume an instantaneous impact of our habitat creation on our environmental outcome, which clearly wouldn't be true in the real world. So I think that's that. The paper is published in Land Use Policy. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Nick. We will wait with questions also till we have these all the innovation presentations. So I'm the next one up, trying to look at whether it's feasible to combine carrots and sticks in a more effective design of environmental schemes. So this, I will first just go through the take-home messages. It's a slightly complicated story, so I'll bear with me. But so just to say, what is it that we're saying? We're saying that fixed rate payments that we've heard about today of environmental services in agricultural landscape have not achieved their environmental targets for the EU or for its member states, which we have already heard. However, uniform regulation through standards also very costly because of the huge environmental and economic heterogeneity across the landscapes, which has been highlighted by Nick. So we still have to make some progress on our environmental goals. So is it possible to combine strict enforceable collective caps at the landscape level with also giving farmers agency to actually find local solutions? Is this feasible? And this is what we're trying to address. So specifically, what kind of coordination mechanism among farmers and between environmental agencies and farmers should we try to develop? And what we're saying is that we have to be quite careful about these mechanisms because they might give undesired counterproductive outcomes. And this is the story that I'm going to take you through. So the case that we're looking at here is the Danish targeted nitrogen regulation case. We're looking, which has been evolved over 40 years. And so in the next 10 minutes, you have to think of this type of landscape. You have a landscape with a great heterogeneity, including both very intensive productive land, but also nature areas. And what is important for water quality regulation is that it's we are really targeting downstream impact. So in the background, you can see a fjord. So it's the water quality down there that we are monitoring and trying to improve. But what we do in the landscape filters through ecological processes through the outcome in the fjord. So this is the real world context that you have to think about. So a brief history of this case is that eutrophication emerges as a political issue in the 80s. And this created a conflict between agricultural and environmental priorities. In 93, there was the development of an action plan of sustainable farming, which introduced a uniform nitrogen application standard. So essentially, yes, what in the talk is called standard. So it's everybody has to reduce their nitrogen inputs. This there was a growing opposition against this in the sector, and there were also rising compliance costs. So in 2015, there was approval of the Agricultural Accord, which was a paradigm shift in regulation towards a more targeted regulation, so away from uniform standard, but also a paradigm shift from a polluter pays towards a beneficiary pays system. So what did this paradigm shift involve, and what were the innovation? So the innovation was that there was an incorporation of ecological and hydrological catchment properties in the scheme design so that you could improve environmental targeting. So it replaced input standards with compensated the catch crops, which were essentially designed to to enhance the nutrient retention capacity in the landscapes, but you could also use other. In Denmark, it's called the catch crop scheme, but you could also use other measures, and it included a cap on total emissions to the downstream water body into the design. So what it essentially does is to have both a voluntary element, but also a fixed substandards element. So the way the scheme is designed is that if the voluntary commitments are insufficient to reach the environmental standards, then a mandatory standards is imposed. So this is the kind of reflecting the heterogeneity across space of where the environmental reductions are needed, and that was incorporated in the scheme. So what questions emerge from this setting? First, you can ask yourself, are catch crops as the measure and the other practices that are included in the scheme, are they really cost effective to meeting end reduction targets? In the scheme has now been running for some years, so has this really been effective? Has this worked, and what is the evidence of that? Thirdly, does the scheme encourage effective coordination between farmers in a catchment? Does it encourage this more cost-effective or more environmentally productive intervention, and whether such coordination can be improved? And these are the questions that we have tried to address. So going to the first question, whether these cost-effective catch crops are really cost-effective to meet the water quality targets. And here we have used an integrated modeling approach with a spatial modeling approach, where we have been trying to get a bird's eye view of, okay, if you were a social planner trying to manage this landscape, would you really choose catch crops as your policy intervention? And so the policy planner then has the opportunity to use different types of measures for what would they choose. What our results show, and this is Rafael, who's here in the room, who has working a lot on this, is that the central planner would not use catch crop if cost effectiveness was the primary policy target. So they would use more intensive land use change measures, such and so wetlands restoration and these kind of different, more intensive measures. So that's the first question. The second question is whether have these targeted schemes really been effective, and what is the evidence of that? And here we have used a type of techniques that Philip was talking about on the screen. So using ex-post impact evaluation, we've used 9 years of agricultural account statistics and trying to figure out what the impact has been of the scheme in terms of farm level purchase in nitrogen, but also crop revenue. And we've used statistical tests to try to assess the impact of the scheme. Our preliminary results show that there's been a minimal impact of nitrogen purchases. So confirming the previous results that it's not been super effective on the environmental side, and also that the effort allocation between farmers within the catchment has not really been targeted in the environmentally effective way, but it has also led to a small but still a statistically significant reduction in farm crop revenues. So this is sort of after the event evaluation. So of course the strength of doing this type of analysis is that it's based on real decision and real landscape and with real farmers, but there's also limitations on this approach because it doesn't really allow a very robust assessment of the downstream water quality outcomes, and we have not doing this. It's hard to do to test different types of schemes. So this is why we move on to doing other things when we're looking at those questions. So this takes us to research question 3 and 4. So whether this current scheme encourage effective coordination between farmers in a catchment, and whether this coordination mechanism can be improved. So here what we're talking about is the internal coordination mechanism, we call it, which is what it means is the coordination of nitrogen mitigation effort between farmers in response to a collective scheme design. So how does farmers respond when a collective scheme is in action? And the success indicators of our collective scheme is that we look at environmental effectiveness, social welfare, but also equity in the catchment. So we use experiments to do this, and this is of course an ex-ante evaluation. It's a hypothetical new collective scheme that we're trying to test. So if you try to draw what that means, is that we're trying to essentially mimic the Danish targeted nitrogen regulation and play around with it. So we have farmers in the catchment, and they have different impacts because they are located in different places in the catchment to the downstream water body, and it's the environmental indicators. We have the regulator that can set the incentive mechanism, and they also set the nitrogen target. The design features that we're looking at is that, of course, there's the load restriction at the water level, the subsidy that is given to farmers, but also the subsidy reduction threat if a target is not met, and then the regulator can also provide a bonus. The internal coordination that we're looking at is that farmers can be excluded from this scheme if they are not performing, and also that farmers can choose to transfer some of the collective subsidy to other farmers to encourage more environmentally effective areas to be enrolled into the scheme. So how we did it in real life is that we went down to 6 agricultural schools in Denmark and did this experiment with 186 what we call next generation farmers, because they were farmers that were in the school to become production manager or agricultural production economists. So they were at a high level of agricultural training. And the experiment is a web-based interactive experiment where the participants use their own computer to play in a catchment, essentially, to try to figure out what their response would be to different designs. So what do we find? So our findings suggest that there is a potential for collective agri-environmental approaches where you combine both occurrence and the voluntary nature of a scheme, but also a mandatory element to make sure we meet the required reductions. It also shows that so what this experiment showed that the collective design actually does achieve the target in a voluntary way, but of course you have the stick, but it actually happens voluntarily. However, our findings also suggest that the internal enforcement mechanism can have adverse effects. So if you interpret this, what it means is that the participants essentially do not transfer sufficient of the collective budget to the more effective farmers. So the effective farmers are not encouraged enough. People are not letting go of the subsidy. But it also shows that the participants seem to be too keen to exclude group members. So essentially, underperforming farmers are punished too much compared to what is socially desirable. So it undermines social welfare, but also equity outcomes. So these are important concerns if we're going to take this experimental evidence to the next level. So lots of words here, but I know these gets up online at some point, so it's easier for other people to engage with it. But the case study we have basically done has shown a big history, a long 40 years of evolution in this big type of regulation. What it suggests is that in order to be successful, we need higher flexibility, and in terms of the measures that can be taken in place, and we need more effective, environmentally effective measures. Catch crops will not solve the environmental goals that we have for Denmark to meet the Water Framework Directive. We need something more effective, also to be cost effective. And our results show that maybe some hybrid of a bottom-up and a top-down scheme could work. But we need to be quite careful about the internal enforcement mechanism, how to encourage more effective and fair allocation of effort. And finally, but sort of generally what we have learned from effect, not just in this, but also in other studies, I think, is that trying to combine both experiments with some modeling can support development of schemes, and also make sure we can test things before we try them out in the real world, and try to avoid making too many mistakes. That's what I had to say, and now translate to the next speaker, the final one. Oh, I just have to say, I just want to make acknowledgement of that lots of people have, in one way or the other, helped this, but not responsible for what I've just said.
Hey, am I on air? Yes. Well, I have the pleasure of giving the last presentation this morning. My name is Uwe Latat-Schloman from Kiel University, and this is joint work with Chi Nguyen, who is listening from a distance, from Perth in Australia. Well, this is the title of my presentation. It's about novel design mechanisms, and we've already seen this slide in Philip's presentation this morning, an overview of novel design mechanisms. So we have talked much about collectively organized nature conservation. Lisbeth presented this very nicely. Then we've talked about payments by results. We haven't yet talked about conservation auctions, which means allocating contracts through competitive bidding rather than offering the government offering a fixed rate payment. So the idea is to invite farmers to submit bids indicating the amount of money they would require to put the land under conservation management. We haven't yet talked much about the fourth issue, spatial coordination of conservation activities. And we haven't talked at all about social norms intervention. So what can we do to secure environmental gains after economic incentives have come to an end, right? This is number 5 is part of ongoing research, a research project with Australia, and I want to focus on, if I can move on. Wait a minute. Oh, that's can use this one. On these two points, namely conservation auctions and spatial coordination, and we have actually combined the two incentive mechanisms in the EFFECT project and have run economic experiments to check or to test the effectiveness of spatial coordination incentives in the context of conservation auctions. So conservation auctions have been used for nearly 40 years in Australia, for the first time in 1986, to allocate contracts for the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a program taking highly erodible land or erosive land out of production in the US where farmers submit a bid to the US Department of Agriculture, and then the government makes a selection of the most cost-effective bids. There is, well, it's going on. It's going on there. I've just seen this. The last sign-up period is for 2023. So it's up and running, and it's being done in the US, and it's also been adopted in Australia. This is an example from Australia, eco-tender, but there have been many other examples. The auction for landscape recovery in Western Australia, for example, or bush tender in the state of Victoria. So there are many practical examples of conservation auctions being run worldwide. Why should we use auctions? Well, one argument in favor of auctions is that bidders reveal their costs with their bids, right? So normally there's a lot of uncertainty or information asymmetry, let's put it like this, between the government and individual farmers. Individual farmers know their opportunity cost of putting land under conservation management, but the government doesn't. And that is, of course, a problem for setting fixed rate payments. So a civil servant in the ministry would have difficulty not knowing all the information that farmers know about their cost of participation in setting appropriate payment rates. So that's an advantage. And the other, and which is closely related to the first one, is price discovery. So we are talking about public goods and environmental benefits as public goods. And there, as we all know, there are no markets for public goods. And so by inviting farmers to submit bids, we can harness private information by bidders in determining the prices for public goods. So it's the better informed party who makes the first step in determining appropriate prices for environmental goods and services. And of course, there is the value for money, the bang for the buck argument. So we can buy more environmental service with a given budget, or we can buy the same amount of environmental service with less environmental public money, right? Then, of course, auctions can be considered as a market for public goods. So there's a market exchange. There is one centralized buyer or demander of public goods, which is some public agency, but there are many decentralized suppliers, the farmers. And if you look at other areas of government procurement contracting, for example, when it comes to the government buying police cars, right, then they normally do it at auction. They invite car manufacturers to provide bids for the public good of police cars. So why not use the same principle to buy environmental goods and services? And finally, there's a fairness argument. So fair tendering is perceived to be a fair allocation mechanism. So the question is, what is the advantage in terms of cost effectiveness compared to fixed payments? Well, we did a few economic experiments to find out the magnitude of the cost savings. And we found that the cost savings are between 30 to 60%, but quickly eroding with repetition. So if you identically repeat a conservation auction, bidders will quickly learn how high they can bid. This was also the experience in the conservation reserve program, and we found this as well. I think after 3 or 4 rounds of repetition, the cost savings were very small. Well, there have been a few actual evaluations of policies. For example, the Challenge Fund scheme, which was run, I think, in the 1990s in Scotland by the Forestry Commission, which found that the cost savings are about 1/3. But there was an additional transaction cost on the part of the Forestry Commission staff. And unfortunately, well, I've been advocating this mechanism in the EU for many years without much effect, because in the EU there is a preference for cooperative approaches and sort of equal treatment mentality. And also, cooperative approaches don't go well with competition, right? So, yeah. So you can either have a competitive mechanism or you can have a cooperative mechanism. Well, I said that the second issue I want to talk about is spatial coordination. And I will combine this with auctions later on, where spatial coordination can improve environmental outcomes. I've given you a few examples here. For example, if you want to create corridors or stepping stones for wildlife coordination, you see it on the right-hand upper picture, where you need to lump land together to create minimum viable habitat sizes, where, well, there's at the bottom creation of flood retention areas, or where it's also important is moorland conservation, because it's very difficult to single out individual plots of moorland and raise the water level on individual plots, because it's all hydrologically connected. And so you need to lump together a lot of land to make moorland conservation, re-wetting of moorlands feasible. So what we have done in effect is we have combined spatial coordination and auctions. And if you run a conservation auction, it looks like this. You get a fragmented conservation habitat. So on the left-hand side, you see individual plots, parcels, right? And if you invite farmers to bid, you get a spatial configuration of offered parcels, right? And of course, farmers will always take out of production the least productive land with the lowest gross margin, land that is located, I don't know, in a wetland area or next to a forest where there's always shade and the yields are low anyway. So you will get an unfavorable spatial configuration of offered parcels. And of course, when you select the parcels, you can't select all the parcels because there's a limited budget. And on the right-hand side, you see, well, in this stylized landscape, you see the spatial configuration of selected parcels. And you see this is results in a fragmented conservation habitat. Now, if you combine conservation auctions, and that's what we have done in the EFFECT project, with an agglomeration bonus, and I think most of you will be familiar with the concept of an agglomeration bonus. It is a payment explicitly designed to reward spatial coordination of conservation efforts among landholders, so that landholders have an incentive to lump land together to create corridors across different farm holdings. So the idea is to create an incentive for farmers to ring their neighbors and say, well, let's put these two plots together under conservation management, and then we get an extra payment for this. This will, the idea is, our hypothesis was that this will result in a better spatial configuration of offered parcels, and then the government could select the most preferred parcels where, well, depending on the cost effectiveness, right? In this case, we have created a sort of a corridor between the left and the right-hand side of this stylized landscape, and we get an aggregated conserved area or habitat, in this case, a corridor. Now, what we have done is we have investigated the effectiveness of an agglomeration bonus in different landscape configurations, right? And that's the novelty of this research. We have asked ourselves the question, does the landscape configuration affect the effectiveness of an agglomeration bonus in the context of an auction, of a conservation auction? And we have looked at 3 different landscape configurations. On the horizontal axis, you see the environmental value of land under conservation. And on the vertical axis, you see the opportunity cost of putting the land, the parcels, under conservation. And so on the right-hand side, you see a positive correlation, which means the high natural value parcels are very costly to put under conservation management. So you can think of an intensively used agricultural landscape, arable landscape, where taking out land out of production would generate very high environmental benefits. And in the middle, the negative landscape, as we call it, is the other way around. Most of you have been to or were in Romania, in Transylvania, where we actually saw this negative correlation. So the highest environmental values were associated with very low opportunity costs. So it's very unproductive land there, low productivity. But if we manage to keep that land as it is under conservation management, that yields an enormous environmental benefit, right? And then we finally have the uncorrelated landscape. And what we have done is we have, we have used a stylized landscape. I'm not going to show you the stylized landscape, but the objective was to create corridors and stepping stones for biodiversity, for wildlife migration, actually. And we have combined different treatments, namely with agglomeration bonus and without agglomeration bonus, and the 3 different landscape types. Right, so we have run 5 sessions each with students. So this is not lab in the field; it's lab in the lab but with agricultural students. So they knew what we were talking about. Many young farmers among them as well. And then we get results like this. And I'm not going to dive into the numbers with you. I rather want, and as you can see, we looked at we measured spatial coordination and we measured cost effectiveness as the 2 most important criteria for policymakers and for the effectiveness of policy. And what we found is this. The agglomeration bonus integrated in a conservation auction reduces the auction's cost effectiveness in the uncorrelated and the negative landscape, and has no effect in the positive landscape. So including a bonus, an agglomeration bonus in a conservation auction makes conservation more costly. So it becomes more costly to buy 1 unit of environmental benefit if you include an agglomeration bonus in an auction. Then the agglomeration bonus, and now it becomes really disappointing, reduces spatial coordination. So it's counterproductive in the uncorrelated landscape, and there is no significant effect in the negative landscape. So it's really not worth it if you have an uncorrelated landscape, so where there is no correlation between environmental benefits and opportunity cost, and there is no significant effect in a landscape like we have seen in Transylvania, right? right? And, well, finally, the agglomeration bonus included in an auction enhances spatial coordination. That's what we want, only in the positive landscape where it is expensive to enroll high natural value land, right? So that is, these are the key findings from this experiment. And of course, we did a lot of other experiments as well. It's too much to present it all here. So the conclusion really for policymakers is they should be very cautious, including an agglomeration bonus in conservation auctions. As I said before, in Europe, we are not using conservation auctions at all in the context of agri-environmental management. We are using auctions to allocate, for example, contracts for fishing vessel decommissioning, where spatial coordination has no role at all. But if the government decides, or if some member state decide, well, money is scarce, money in the second pillar in particular of the common agricultural policy is scarce, and we need to achieve better value for money rather than making sure that we dish out the money, that we spend the budget, then in the future, I hope that governments will make more use of conservation auctions, and then it's not advisable to include an agglomeration bonus in such a mechanism. Well, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
So we're more or less on time, is that correct? I think so, I hope. So question from here from the audience or also from the online people is now encouraged. Just to these.
Jan has a question.
It's maybe more general question to Nick and also to you. Every model, every aspect of planning is a matter of parameters you choose. So in your case, you made a corridor. In Nick's case, you made a model for habitat, which is supposed to be the most efficient version. We know everything is subjective. Everything is changing with conditions. Everything changing with our knowledge. So in Nick's case, if the farmer figures out the basics of the model, how it's calculated, probably he still does the same like in case of Bavaria. You just sow the species you need and you get your money, even if the rest of the system doesn't support at all. Just I know the model. And your case, if it's currently, it's based on perception that your parameter is environmental value. And as corridor, at the same time, is it like really like the parameter you need? In many cases, in negative landscape, the meaning of the environmental value is totally different from that what is in a positive landscape. So it's everything is behind the parameters and the emphasis you need. And so it might be that it's always just a time and everything will be adapted to find the most efficient way to forage supports. And we end up with almost the same situation like now.
Difficult question. But well, ecologists as you are, tell me that not every species, particularly bird species, requires a consolidated habitat. So if I remember correctly, the lapwing, I think, requires many different spots in the countryside rather than one consolidated. Yeah, but there are species that do require consolidated habitats, right? Minimum habitat size, for example, for recolonization. If you want to target a species that requires a large habitat size, then an agglomeration bonus might be the right means. That was our hypothesis, at least at the beginning. But it turned out, in the context of an auction, it won't work. It makes conservation contracting more costly to conserve one species, one bird number more costly, and it doesn't contribute to consolidating the habitat. Nick.
Thanks, Uwe. I just wanted to ask a question that I should know the answer to, right? So one of the referees for our American Journal Ag Econ paper, which is also about agglomeration bonus in an auction, said you've actually got a reward for spatial coordination twice. So one reward is you get a bonus if your bid is accepted and so is your neighbor's bid. But you can also have a spatial coordination benefit in the rule that you use for choosing bids. So if your environmental benefit score is a function of how close is my plot to your plot, you're essentially rewarding coordination twice. So my question is, in your experiment, and I should know the answer, but I can't remember, do you reward it twice?
Yes, we do. We do. In the experiment we did, we offered an agglomeration bonus, an explicit payment for spatial coordination, and we made a bid selection rule that ranks bids, consolidated bids, higher than individual plots, right? But we didn't tell the players, the subjects. Well, we only said we would. Well, yes, we did. We did actually tell them. We said the regulator would rank or would put a higher value on corridors and stepping stones rather than individual parcels. But we didn't reveal the actual selection rule. But yes, in the end, we paid twice, or we rewarded spatial coordination twice. Frank.
I have a comment to you, Nick, because these models, I think from a farmer's viewpoint, they are very interesting, because if they fail, that is the scientists who fail, that is not the farmers. But I think you have to combine the models with one-time compensation also, because in Denmark, if the farmers take the land out of production, and then we think it's go 10 years from now, and then we find it red list species out at the field, then he can't go back as a farmer. So you need to have models combined with compensation. That is quite important. I think that will count for the whole Europe. And that's what we always in the advisory service listen to, at what the farmers are concerning about. So you have to make models combined with this. Otherwise, I don't think it will function.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great point. So the way I understood Bartowski's original idea was a farm advisor goes to the farm, sits down with the farmer, opens her computer, and says, here is my model of predicting how many of species X you will get on your farm if you undertake these 3 actions. And your payment will depend on what my model predicts. So if I go to your farm, I may predict if you change from wheat to low intensity grassland, you'll get 6 more lapwings. So I'll pay you 6 times the subsidy. I go to Uwe's farm and my model predicts I'm only going to get 2 more lapwings because he's further from the sea or he's closer to a forest or something. So he gets paid less than you do for doing the same thing. But you're right. First of all, I'm offering you a contract over a number of years. And so it might be over time that how many extra lapwing I get would change. And I'm going to have to offer you enough money for you to be willing to sign the contract. And I might discover in 5 years' time, my model is doing a terrible job of predicting how many extra lapwing I get anyway. I think the original context that Bartowski had it in was soil conservation measures, not bird numbers, but we've used it for bird numbers.
I will now invite Lisa to talk from as a representative for one of our sister projects, and to just go. And afterwards, also the other sister project will be online.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. It's always when the discussion gets most interesting that you have to stop and listen to someone else, I guess. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Sharif. I was involved in the Contracts 2.0 project. I work for ZALF in Germany, and my role there was mainly organizational and project management, but I think I can still give you a little overview, and I will do my best to answer any questions that you have about detailed project results. I wrote a lot of things down. I was asked to talk a little bit about the similarities between our projects. And now I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Contracts 2.0 project, but maybe to very briefly summarize, I guess the objective was the same, and what we tried to do is co-design innovative contracts or contract elements at least to provide more ecosystem services. And the way that Contracts 2.0, the way that we approached it was with kind of two methods. So on the one hand, we had the scientific research, much like you did, and on the other side, we had a participatory approach, as in the case studies that you conducted as well. And for us, one of the big achievements was actually this participatory approach. So we established what we called contract innovation labs and policy innovation labs. And especially in the contract innovation labs, we invited farmers in 11 different regions throughout Europe to discuss these innovative approaches with the researchers from the project. And because I think what we really learned is that the best way to learn is to learn from one another. And this was really one of our big outcomes. And I think that maybe one result also to highlight that we produced 10 practice briefs where we really focused on these practitioner perspectives. And a lot of the benefits and the risks or the considerations of these innovative approaches are kind of the same that you also found out. Like I recognized Contracts 2.0's results in a lot of the things that you presented here today in terms of the benefits and how to approach these different contracts. And one key message that we also have is these hybrid contracts. So we also saw a really high potential in the combination of contract features, to really hoist the benefits of all of these different approaches, to lower the threshold to participate and to improve the impact. And I guess that is one big similarity that I can see. And this was actually a result that came out from both the scientific side of the project and the participatory side of the project. So we also had a lot of scientific research in terms of behavioral experiments, discrete choice experiments, assessing farmers' preferences and farmers' willingness to cooperate with each other, and also in agri-environmental schemes. And I feel like a lot of the results are the same. Yes, one thing that I wanted to point out as well is coming from the participatory approach as well, is that one of the policy recommendations maybe that we presented at the end of the project is to really try and allow resources for this kind of co-design approach, because we experienced a lot of benefits and a lot of understanding for each other's positions. So when we brought together the policymakers on a local level who actually design and enforce these schemes with the farmers, they kind of finally talked to each other, and that increased mutual understanding a lot. And we really see a high potential in continuing these kind of participatory approaches. So one of the things that we really want to emphasize is that policy should give resources for these co-design approaches, because they are time consuming, they require a lot of effort, they have high initial transaction costs, but in the end, it will be worth it, is what we think. So transaction costs will decrease and the ecological effectiveness will arguably increase. One difference maybe to point out very quickly, because I think I have to be a bit brief about it as well, is that contracts also included a value chain approach, or tried to consider value chain schemes when looking at these innovative approaches. And that was actually quite difficult, because it was difficult to get companies and other actors of the value chain to participate in our innovation labs. But one of the things also is that we do see a high potential in market-based solutions, basically. So we had the same consideration that the standards are quite difficult to develop and costly as well, but also on the other hand, that it is worth it to look for solutions that can maybe include additional economic reward for farmers outside of the CAP. So we tried to look at different labeling approaches, different market-based solutions, but to be honest, it didn't advance as much as with the other schemes. And yeah, I think that's one of the differences in the project, that we had this kind of focus included as well. But there are a lot of complementary results, I think. And for us, I guess it was the same for you. It was quite nice to have this 4-year-long project, which is quite a long time, which was also necessary for this participatory approach. And now, we kind of hope to carry over these results in other projects, in other endeavors, trying to develop these approaches further. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. I'll just give Tanya the space. If Tanya, are you here?
Yes, thank you. I'm here.
Yeah,
I'm just here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Do you see me now?
Second to get you.
Do you see me now?
Not yet. Very soon, I hope.
I have activated my camera.
Hang on a minute. I'm sure it's happening very soon. We can hear you at least. So that's a good.
So that's the most important, I think, that you can hear me.
So that's the most important, I think, that you can hear me. Yeah. So if
I just need to.
We'll maybe see you very soon.
Maybe you can switch off your micro, then I do not have the double sound. That's great. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you also for this nice journey that you conducted us through your project activities of effect, and also some final results and also the primary results. As Lisa already indicated, there are some similarities in all the three sister projects, but there are also some great differences. So having said this, I would like to go into some specific aspects. And this is, for example, that when starting the three projects, I think all of us had some theoretical, typical type of project. We really had the result-based project in mind, and the collective approach, and the practice-based, and all of us realized that when going into the case studies, that there are features collected together that are not typical for pure contracts, like pure result-based contracts. So I really liked this, that you named them as add-on features also. So, and we also found out that there are many cases in the practice of hybrid agri-environmental schemes. One other point is that you highlighted some success factors, and I think this is important to we mention them, because we are now in the CAP phase that is quite short. The administrations are already trying to redesign some eco schemes, some agri-environment measures, but also thinking about the next CAP. So I think you identified the inclusion of a number of stakeholders in the design process as a real benefit of successful schemes, the importance of having the high knowledge exchange. And I think the 3 projects of that contributed quite heavily to it. You also indicated how much interaction you had with different stakeholders, be it the students that you integrated into experiments, or also farmers that followed the survey, or a lot of interviews. And then the other third one is the flexible implementation. I know that the term flexibility is not very much liked by the administration, but I think how it is presented in the way you work with it, it shows the real added value, because it allows to adapt to the heterogeneous landscapes, to the different farm times, to really settings. Also, when it comes to the learning curve, there are farmers who join newly schemes. There are farmers who are already for a long time in schemes. So this was really a nice way of showing how this could deliver. A further point that I would like to highlight is, because it was mentioned by several of you, is that there is a difficulty to measure the additionality. I think this will be something that we will never solve because of the long history of agri-environment measures. But a real additionality, what we have now, are the eco schemes. This is completely new to have annual schemes, and to make the most of it. A lot of the outcomes of the effect project can also help in the design, in the future design, and the further evolving of this type of schemes. And I liked the statement from Uwe, where he's told that at the beginning of auctions, there are cost savings, but quickly eroding with repetition. And for me, this is a typical example how farmers can quickly learn and adapt to new situations. And we should not see this as a negative point, but we should really take this as a positive point. Why not starting with auctions, and then once something is established, we can also continue with a lighter system of payment. The same for the scheme where we had this the possibility of special coordination. Yes, at the beginning it might be costly, but I'm quickly surely that over the time it will be less costly and bring added value. So for me, your today what you presented showed that there is a high potential, and I really hope that we can continue to work on it.